In the media, everyone was only talking about the KTM 390 Adventure R. It was the big new A2 travel enduro hope. Brilliant off-road, suitable for touring on the road, and nobody was talking about the 390 Adventure X. So does it have nothing to offer, or could it actually be the secret tip in KTM's A2 lineup? That's what we're looking at today. So, hello and welcome from Spain, because this is also one of the tests we are doing as part of our away garage here in the Barcelona area, where we've basically shortened our winter a bit and extended the test season. Firstly, so we can test the latest new bikes that are already available here for you, and also to catch up on models we simply didn't get around to last year. And that is exactly the case with the 390 Adventure X.1 for us as well. All the media attention was focused on the R version. We took it on the Friuli tour, we did A2 travel enduro comparisons and so on and so on. But the X somehow got left out, and that's why it's exciting to see what the slightly cheaper, more road-focused version of the 390 Adventure can do. Because the 390 Adventure range was heavily revised specifically for 2025 and then split into these two versions. The X version, as you can see straight away, gets more road-focused tires, 19 inches at the front and 17 at the rear. Then we've got shorter suspension travel, 200 millimeters instead of the 250 of the R version front and rear. And here on the X, the WP suspension isn't adjustable either, except for rear spring preload. Other differences are the lower handlebar and the simpler LC display. Otherwise, those are basically the differences, because on top of that, logically, the bike is lower thanks to the shorter suspension travel. We now have an accessible seat height of 825 millimeters. I'll just hop on right away. I'm 1.85 meters, so seat heights usually aren't really an issue for me, but you can see I get down to the ground very, very comfortably. At the same time, the knee angle doesn't feel overly tight when riding either. So overall, it still gives you that typical travel enduro feeling, but everything is a bit more compact or lower than on the R version. The first thing we did after picking it up, as so often, was ride through town. And since the X version is supposed to stand out more as an everyday bike and less as an off-road purist, it was naturally interesting to see how it performs in an urban environment. So, we've escaped the city again pretty quickly, because it's just so much nicer out here on these quieter country roads in the sunshine. But still, with the 390 Adventure X being pitched more as an everyday machine, riding around built-up areas and urban environments is obviously a big part of the story. So what was it like? First of all, the lower seat position is a plus, even for fairly tall riders like me. It simply makes things easier on uneven surfaces and, for example, in car parks. It also makes life easier if you misjudge something when filtering through traffic and suddenly have to throw down a quick safety step. On the tall 390 Adventure R, especially for riders with shorter legs, that was already right on the limit, and every degree of lean mattered. Even if the weight hasn't actually gone down here, we're still at 165 kilograms dry, which means just under 180 kilograms with a full tank. And I think especially for beginners, it's a really good feeling to know that, hey, I can actually reach the ground and I've got the bike under control when stationary or during very slow maneuvers. It's easy to handle, also thanks to the light clutch, for example. Very light, very easy to modulate. Secondly, the engine. When I first tested it last year, it was almost too soft at the bottom end. It had a tendency to stall very quickly. The engine has little flywheel mass, and it's meant to be very gentle, low down and rather rev happy, trying to get into the part of the rev range where it actually makes power. But back then it was just too much. It really did stall quickly. There was a recall after that, and now several months later, so this isn't a direct back-to-back comparison, but from memory, I'd say it genuinely feels a touch more confident at low revs now, a touch easier in that throttle clutch interplay and in operation overall, so you're not constantly stalling it. And yet the character is still there. Extremely gentle in the way it builds revs down low, and the real power only comes from about 5,000 to 6,000 revs per minute. That means that in town, if you want to make brisk progress, accelerate quickly, overtake a car, you still have to be in the right gear. Cruising along at 50 in 4th or 5th is all well and good, but then opening the throttle, hardly anything happens, if anything at all. So you always have to keep that in mind. Luckily, the quick shifter we've got fitted here works exceptionally well even at low revs. So stirring the gearbox around a bit at city speeds is actually excellent. And then the last point that mattered in town, I think the steering lock is okay. There are travel enduros in the A2 segment that offer better steering lock. Here it's decent enough. And maybe one more point, we only get a simple LC display here, which in terms of contrast honestly reminds me of the calculators I had at school. Even in the LC display world, there are nicer looking ones on the market, but so be it. It's reasonably readable, it works, and despite being an LC display, it's even good enough for basic smartphone connectivity. But luckily, we were able to leave the city behind pretty quickly, and from Barcelona, you really don't have to go far before you hit dreamlike, twisty country roads like the one we're on right now. And that's what makes the 390 Adventure range interesting as well, because for 2025 they were basically developed from scratch. As before, we've got the single-cylinder engine from the 390 Duke in there, but for example, it no longer shares its frame with the Duke. It now gets its own frame, one that's been tuned a bit more towards off-road and made a bit more robust for additional loads at the rear, luggage and so on. But I still find it a bit of a shame, I have to say, or at least interesting, that they put so much effort into the frame while the engine is still identical to the one in the Duke. And you can simply tell from the character. On the Adventure X, that's probably less of an issue anyway, because I see it as being at home on asphalt 90 to 95% of the time, as a city bike, as we've already discussed, or for shorter tours and weekend trips, basically 99% on the road. And it works well there. You just have to make sure, just as in town, that for anything requiring power, for any maneuver where you think, right, I want this level of acceleration now, you've got to be in the right gear. The change from around 5.5 to 6,000 revs is really dramatic. Below that, it's also very restrained in terms of sound. So if you're cruising along and then suddenly think, right, I want to drive out of this corner now, and you're still in the lower half of the rev range, there's almost no acceleration. It builds revs and speed only very slowly, almost a bit painfully. But once you hit that magic threshold of 5.5, 6,000 revs, the engine suddenly pulls really nicely. So if you want to make decent progress on country roads, there's a lot of shifting involved. At the same time though, this X version definitely has advantages thanks to the smaller front wheel. It's simply more agile. It turns in with less effort through the fairly wide handlebar and drops into lean very willingly. Once you're in the lean, first of all, you've got a bit more rubber up front thanks to the wider tire. And secondly, you've got a slightly better connection to the front wheel because of the shorter suspension travel. And I also think the suspension itself, despite the lack of adjustment, is well set up. I'm not the heaviest rider, and with my weight I still felt it worked very nicely. It's also not tuned too softly for comfort, which often happens in these cheaper beginner segments because they want to make sure it feels comfortable. That's not the case here. On rough roads the comfort was acceptable. I can't really say the same about the brakes. The Bi-Bree braking setup is very soft and rather defensively tuned. The pressure point is incredibly soft, and there's also a lot of lever travel before any meaningful braking force builds up at all. Sometimes even during medium braking, I'm almost pulling the lever back onto my fingers, even through a glove. And if you then want to brake harder, first of all, you already need quite a lot of hand force. It also feels rather vague because of that very soft and long pressure point. And for genuinely harder deceleration, you almost have to bring the rear brake in as well. Then it works. It's not a bike where I'd say you want to attack corners with insanely hard trail braking, but I still think they could have given it a bit more feedback and a clearer pressure point. And I also have some questions about how well these brakes hold up, because on the 390 Adventure R, and unless I'm mistaken, they're the same brakes, it was pretty much done after about half a mountain descent. So I'm cautiously questioning the durability of these brakes as well, even though I couldn't really test that today, simply because here in Spain, around this area, you don't have the same long, steep descents we get in the Alps on some of the steeper passes. But of course, it's not just about sporty blasting around, it's also meant to handle more relaxed touring. I'll say this straight away. We didn't have to cover any huge distances on it here simply because we are blessed in the Barcelona area. There are so many brilliant roads very close by. No long distances were necessary, and we didn't have the time either. From my admittedly rough long distance impression, what can I say? The wind protection is okay. At 1.85 m, the wind and turbulence at motorway speed hits me pretty much around nose to eye level. It creates a bit of louder buffeting, and it's not adjustable, so that's just how it is. I think for a smaller rider, the wind protection is actually very good, because at the same time it gets quite wide lower down, so your chest or rather your upper body is kept pretty well out of the wind. If you were 10 centimeters shorter, maybe even 15, then I think the wind protection would actually be very good. For me, it just doesn't quite work out. At the same time, I do have to praise the fact that the permissible gross weight is on a level where you could genuinely consider riding this bike two up. 176 kilograms fully fueled according to KTM. Permissible total weight 375 kilograms. So that's nearly another 200 kilograms on top. I'd say that's perfectly respectable for a touring bike. And KTM also offers luggage options. The suspension comfort over rougher motorway sections, things like expansion joints, is all handled nicely. No real comfort weaknesses from the suspension that I was able to notice. As for the seat, it's hard for me to say without having done a genuinely long stage on it, but my feeling is that this is the kind of seat that compresses fairly quickly. I had the same thing on the 390 Adventure R. There too, the seat was a bit on the sportier side, and here, at first it feels okay, but after the longest ride I did, which was about an hour, I already had the feeling that, ooh, this seat starts to flatten out a bit. What is definitely a positive is how far you can go with the 14-liter tank. We're seeing fuel consumption below 4 liters if you're doing a mixed ride. Only when you do what we're doing here, going up and down a twisty road and always trying to stay in the sportiest part of the rev range, does consumption go above 4 liters. But in realistic use, I'd say 3.5 liters per 100 kilometers is easily doable. That means you'll probably get around 400 kilometers out of the 14-liter tank, which is impressive. So overall, it's actually a pretty decent touring experience. And here in Spain, you can do more than just tour or push on along beautiful asphalt roads. You're also allowed to raise a bit of dust, and as you can see from the lightly dirt-covered Apollo Trampler tires, which were unknown to me until now, we did go and play in the dirt a little, but I didn't check out how the Adventure X behaves on loose surfaces on my own. We've arrived at the gravel section of the 390 Adventure X test. And yes, it may not be the off-road focused version of the 390 Adventure, but I still brought in some serious, or let's say expert support for the loose stuff. Bernd, you were Supermoto World Champion. People know you from various rider training courses. They know you from various stunt shows where you normally move, jump and do who knows what else with bikes that weigh, let's say, not quite twice as much, but nearly. So, and that makes this riding gear an interesting sight. With your skills and your riding ability, do you feel seriously limited on the 390 Adventure X on easy gravel tracks? That's all we did after all. And that's probably all this bike will usually be used for anyway. Does anything really limit you there, or do you say, hey, for a relaxed gravel party, it's exactly right?
Yes, absolutely exactly right, because it was actually a lot of fun. It's amazing how nimble a bike in this class feels. For me, the big comparison is always this. Everyone says, yeah, entry-level class, only beginners on it, only weak riders. But as you say, even as an experienced rider, I had just as much fun on this bike. And the slogan, ready to race, does fit, because the bike really does have proper ambitions off-road. You can have fun with it. And in the sort of light off-road riding we did, a bit uphill, a bit downhill, gravel roads, it was really good fun. Super nimble. You can even dodge puddles if you want to keep your boots clean. And it was mega cool. Give the clutch a quick snap and it comes up on the rear wheel exactly as it should.
Now, as a layman, I picked out a few points of criticism. I mean, they should be mentioned. In loose terrain especially, the handlebar is a bit low. On the road, I noticed that the brake has a very soft, vague pressure point. The suspension isn't adjustable, and it also feels to me as if the standing position isn't entirely natural. The engine also has relatively little shove at low revs. Any of those points where you'd say, yeah, I'd prefer that differently too? Or with enough skill, does it basically not matter?
Well, in motorsport, it was always like this. You get the bike and you have to finish the race as quickly as possible. So you ride around the flaws, even if there are flaws. And of course, the points you mentioned are there. Sure, the handlebar is relatively low. I'm almost 10 centimeters shorter than you. I'm just standing on a slope here, so it doesn't look quite as dramatic. For me, it's okay-ish, but the position is definitely quite sporty. So you sit pretty far bent forward. If you want to ride fast, that's exactly the right position. But if I had to ride like that naturally all day, it would get a bit more tiring. So if you want to ride a lot off-road, a handlebar riser would definitely be a good investment. One, as for the torque, sure, it's a small single, so it doesn't have that much torque. You can tell you have to be very gentle with the clutch. You can work around that well if you're good with the clutch and keep the bike lightly on the throttle. Then things like turning tightly at full lock, like where we turned around here, that all works too. But of course, you do have to be a bit careful. That's where it lacks a little.
Suspension not adjustable. Do you feel it lacks stability? Does it lack comfort? What was it like when you were pushing it on the gravel tracks? Any little rocking motions, or actually well configured despite there being no adjustment?
You do have to say, I weigh around 65 kilos without riding gear. And for my weight, from what I rode, the basic setup was okay. It gave good feedback when we were riding a bit faster over some rocky edges, drifting through corners. It gave me the confidence I needed. So I wouldn't say it absolutely needs to be much firmer at the front or much firmer at the rear. Roughly speaking, I'd say it was fine. For very slow riding though, it could be that here and there the suspension could respond a bit more softly and be tuned a bit more for comfort.
So nobody needs to deny the Adventure X its gravel ambitions, but of course you can see it above all from the wheels. And there'll be the biggest limit if you want to take things a bit more seriously. Up front we've got a 110 tire on a 19-inch wheel, but for gravel and for the sort of riding the Adventure X will usually be used for, that's absolutely fine. At the rear we've got a 17-inch wheel, so I'd say it suits the target group perfectly.
Yes.
But of course, compared with the CF Moto 450 MT or other more off-road capable A2 travel enduros, and we've got a comparison of those as well, so definitely go and watch that. Compared with those, you can feel that this one is more road-oriented, let's put it that way.
I'd say the same. For people who are 50-50 on and off-road, it definitely works. And I think with KTM especially, people who want to go more into the dirt will probably pay the extra for the R version and then get the more adjustable suspension and all the rest of it as well.
Right, and I think that covers everything about the gravel section. Bernd, thanks for your know-how and thanks to all of you. And now let's move on to the next part. And with that we've now covered the city, touring / twisty road fun, and a bit of playing around on loose surfaces, which means it's time for the conclusion. How much does the Adventure X actually offer? Is it really inferior to its media darling sister, the R version? First of all, the price. It is noticeably cheaper than its R sister. In Germany you pay just under 5,700 euros and in Austria just under 6,400 euros. Yes, the price battle in these segments is fierce. For example, you can get a Royal Enfield Himalayan for under 6,000 euros in Germany or only just over 6,000 in Austria. And the CF Moto 450 MT is at a comparable price level too, even if it sits a bit higher. So this relatively low price isn't a unique selling point on its own. But if you look at what you get for those 5,700 euros in Germany, for example, you get a bike that tours quite well, as long as you're not too sensitive when it comes to vibrations. You've also got a certain amount of space, some options for mounting luggage, and good wind protection. So basically it's got pretty much everything you need for touring. At the same time, riding around town also works well, easy to handle, and thanks to the shorter suspension, it's much more attractive for shorter riders and easier when maneuvering or threading through tight gaps between rows of cars. So it works well there too. Then there's twisty road riding. Yes, you always have to be in the right gear if you want to make proper progress. But once you get used to that, the suspension is still decent despite not being adjustable, with good damping behavior and good stability. The brakes are a bit too soft, but then again, it's not exactly a hardcore hooligan bike, so it's still okay. And then there are the gravel ambitions. Even Bernd Hiemer said, yeah, it works. Yes, the standing position is a bit too hunched over, but for short excursions onto loose surfaces now and then, I'd say that works too. At the same time, it feels a bit more agile because of the smaller front wheel, and it's simply much more affordable than the not exactly cheap 390 Adventure R. So I think it gets a bit less attention than it deserves. It's just much closer to the old 390 Adventure. And I think, especially for many riders who were already happy with the older generations of the KTM 390 Adventure and who perhaps got tempted by all the media hype around the R version, but who actually rarely venture onto loose surfaces and aren't the tallest people or the kind who are comfortable with tall bikes, then the 390 Adventure X will definitely be the better choice. It'll make life easier in lots of everyday situations. And for the little weekend adventure, as I said, the 390 Adventure X can do that too. But I'm curious what you think. Is the 390 Adventure X basically uninteresting because there's the cooler R? Or is it actually the better choice for most people? Let us know what you think in the comments. And apart from that, please give me, Bernd and Patrick behind the camera a thumbs up if you enjoyed this test, this really overdue test of the X390 Adventure. Thanks for watching, thanks for taking the time, and don't miss any of the other Spain tests either. Hopefully we'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye. Adios.